Huertgen Forest, Germany, December 24th, 1944, 1800 hours, and Sergeant Ralph Henry Blank of the 121st Infantry Regiment, 8th Infantry Division, stands shivering in snow that reaches past his boots, watching his wounded companion Harry slowly dying from blood loss, while two armies tear each other apart in what history will remember as the Battle of the Bulge. Ralph and his two fellow soldiers, Jim and Robin, have been separated from their battalion for 3 days, wandering through forests where every shadow might conceal a German soldier, every sound might signal an artillery barrage, and every step through the snow brings them closer to either salvation or capture. Harry's leg wound has turned gangrenous. His face has gone white as death, and Ralph knows with absolute certainty that without shelter and medical attention, his friend will not survive another night in the brutal December cold. What Ralph cannot possibly know as he helps carry Harry through the darkening forest toward a distant light flickering between the trees is that the decision he makes in the next few minutes will require him to place his life and the lives of his companions into the hands of the enemy, trusting German civilians in a country where American soldiers are taught that every German is a potential threat, and where the penalty for showing mercy to Americans is execution by firing squad. The confidence that brought American forces deep into Germany has been shattered by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's surprise offensive that began 9 days earlier when over 400,000 German troops crashed through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, creating a bulge in Allied lines that threatened to split the American and British armies and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. The attack caught American forces completely by surprise, with German troops advancing in the worst winter weather Europe had seen in decades, using fog and snow to mask their movements and prevent Allied air superiority from making any difference. Sergeant Ralph Blank, a bricklayer from Frederick, Maryland before the war, has seen combat before, but nothing prepared him or his unit for the ferocity of the German assault. His battalion was overrun 3 days ago during a German attack near the village of Huertgen, with American positions dissolving under the weight of panzer tanks and waves of German infantry who seemed to appear out of nowhere in the snow. Ralph and his two companions, along with Harry, who took a German bullet through his leg during the retreat, managed to escape into the forest, but in the chaos of battle, they lost contact with the rest of their unit and have been wandering ever since, trying to find American lines while avoiding German patrols that are everywhere in these woods. The American Army's situation in late December 1944 is far more desperate than civilians back home understand. With over 19,000 American soldiers killed and another 60,000 wounded or captured during the German offensive, making the Battle of the Bulge the bloodiest engagement American forces will fight in any war. The fighting around Huertgen has been particularly brutal, with American infantry forced to fight in dense forest, where visibility is measured in yards, where artillery shells explode in treetops, showering soldiers with wooden shrapnel that tears through flesh as effectively as metal, and where the frozen ground makes digging foxholes nearly impossible. Ralph has watched friends die in ways that will haunt him for the rest of his life. Cut down by machine gun fire, blown apart by artillery, or simply freezing to death in foxholes during the long winter nights. He has learned that survival requires constant vigilance, that hesitation means death, and that the enemy is everywhere. But now Harry is dying, and Ralph must make a choice that goes against every instinct his training has given him. The cottage Ralph sees through the trees is small and isolated, smoke rising from its chimney suggesting warmth and shelter inside, but also indicating that someone is home, and in this part of Germany, that someone is almost certainly German. American soldiers have been briefed repeatedly about the dangers of approaching German civilians, warned that German women have shot American soldiers in the back, that German children have been trained to report American positions, and that entering a German home without proper reconnaissance is suicide. The official policy is clear. American soldiers are to avoid contact with German civilians whenever possible, to treat all Germans as potential enemies, and to never, under any circumstances, reveal their positions or weakness to anyone who might pass information to German military forces. Ralph knows that knocking on that door violates every rule he has been taught, knows that the people inside might be fanatical Nazis who will kill them or turn them over to German troops, knows that he is quite possibly leading his companions into a trap. But Harry is unconscious now, his breathing shallow and laboured, And the alternative to knocking on that door is watching Harry die in the snow while they themselves freeze to death in the forest. Ralph and Jim carry Harry through the last 100 yards to the cottage, with Robin providing cover with his rifle, ready to shoot if Germans appear. As they approach, Ralph can hear music from inside. Christmas carols sung in German, reminding him with painful clarity that it is Christmas Eve, and that he should be home in Maryland with his family, instead of carrying a dying friend through enemy territory. He stops at the door, exchanges a long look with Jim that communicates all the fear and uncertainty they both feel, then knocks, knowing that this moment will either save them or doom them. The door opens to reveal a German woman and a young boy, approximately 12 years old, both staring at the 3 armed American soldiers with expressions of shock and fear. Ralph cannot speak German. The woman cannot speak English, but somehow through gestures and a few words of French that the woman knows, they communicate the essential facts. Harry is dying. They need help. They will not harm anyone. The woman, whose name Ralph will learn is Elizabeth Vinken, stands in the doorway for what feels like an eternity, looking at Harry's pale face and the blood-soaked bandage on his leg, looking at Ralph and Jim with their weapons and their desperate eyes, and then, in violation of every law of the Third Reich, invites the enemy into her home. The risk Elizabeth is taking cannot be overstated, as harbouring enemy soldiers is considered treason by Nazi Germany and is punishable by death, not just for the person who committed the crime, but often for their entire family. The Gestapo and Wehrmacht military police are active in this region, conducting sweeps to find deserters and enforce discipline, and the discovery of 3 American soldiers in Elizabeth's cottage would result in immediate execution for both Elizabeth and her son Fritz. German civilians have been executed for far less, shot or hanged for hiding Jews, for listening to Allied radio broadcasts, or for making defeatist comments about the war. Elizabeth knows all this, has lived under Nazi rule long enough to understand the consequences of what she is doing, but makes the decision anyway, telling Ralph and Jim through her limited French to carry Harry inside and lay him on Fritz's bed. Ralph will never forget that moment, stepping into the warm cottage with its smell of cooking food and pine branches, feeling the heat from the fire begin to thaw his frozen hands, watching this German mother tend to Harry with the same care she would show her own child. In that instant, all the propaganda about brutal Germans, all the speeches about the inhuman enemy, all the hatred carefully cultivated by war, dissolves in the face of simple human compassion. Fritz Vinken, watching from the corner as his mother treats the wounded American, has been taught in Hitler youth meetings that Americans are criminals and gangsters, inferior soldiers who will run when facing German troops, unworthy of respect or mercy. But what he sees are 3 young men, barely older than teenagers, exhausted and frightened, one of them dying, all of them looking at his mother with gratitude that transcends language. Fritz's father, a baker who now works for the German army, has told him different stories, has whispered when he thought Fritz was not listening that the war is lost, that Hitler is insane, that Germany will be destroyed if the fighting continues. Now Fritz sees the truth in his father's words, sees in these American soldiers the same fear and suffering he has seen in German soldiers, realizes that war makes victims of everyone, regardless of which uniform they wear. His mother has taught him that Christmas is a time for peace and mercy, that the teachings of Christ supersede the orders of any government, and now she is putting those beliefs into action, in a way that might cost them both their lives. The cottage becomes a temporary sanctuary as Elizabeth prepares a meal of potatoes and a rooster the family had been saving for Christmas dinner, while one of the American soldiers who speaks a bit of French tells her about their 3 days in the forest, about losing their battalion, about Harry's wound, and their desperate search for friendly lines. Ralph sits by the fire, feeling warmth return to his body while watching this German woman and her son moving about the small cottage, and experiences a cognitive dissonance that will stay with him for the rest of his life. These are the enemy, the people his government has told him to hate, the citizens of a nation that started a war which has killed millions, yet they are showing him kindness that asks nothing in return, risking their lives for men they have every reason to fear. The official narrative of the war, the clear distinction between good guys and bad guys, the certainty that Americans are liberators and Germans are oppressors, becomes complicated in ways that no training manual or propaganda film addressed. Ralph realizes that Elizabeth could be his own mother, that Fritz could be his younger brother, that the only real difference between them is an accident of birth that put them on opposite sides of a conflict neither family wanted. Then comes the second knock on the door, and Ralph's heart stops as Fritz opens it without hesitation, expecting more Americans, only to find 4 German soldiers standing in the snow, asking for shelter. Ralph and Jim grab their rifles, preparing for the fight they know cannot be won, ready to die shooting rather than be captured, but Elizabeth walks calmly outside to speak with the German corporal. Through the open door, Ralph can hear her telling the Germans they can stay, that there will be food for everyone, but that they must leave their weapons outside because this is Christmas Eve, and there will be no shooting in her home. The German corporal objects, his voice rising in anger when he learns there are Americans inside, and Ralph prepares for the inevitable. But then Elizabeth's voice cuts through the cold night air with words that Ralph will remember for the next 50 years. You could be my sons, and so could they in there. A boy with a gunshot wound fighting for his life and his 2 friends lost like you, and just as hungry and exhausted as you are. This one night, this Christmas night, let us forget about killing. The silence that follows seems to last forever, with Ralph watching through the window as the German corporal struggles with his decision, knowing that his duty requires him to capture or kill the Americans, knowing that following Elizabeth's orders violates every military regulation and Nazi Party directive, knowing that this decision will define what kind of man he chooses to be. Then, incredibly, the German soldiers begin stacking their weapons by the woodpile, and Elizabeth comes back inside to collect the Americans' rifles, creating an impromptu truce that should be impossible in the middle of the war's most savage battle. The German soldiers enter the cottage, and for several long minutes Germans and Americans stare at each other in hostile silence, hands near knives and sidearms that Elizabeth did not confiscate, each group waiting for the other to make a threatening move. Ralph studies the 4 Germans, sees that 2 are barely 16 years old, sees the exhaustion in their eyes, sees that they are just as lost and frightened as he and his companions, and realizes that Elizabeth has created something that no general or diplomat has managed to achieve. A moment of peace, forced upon men who have been trained to kill each other. The transformation that occurs over the next few hours represents everything that makes war both terrible and occasionally transcendent, as enemies become human beings sharing a meal on Christmas Eve. One of the German soldiers, a former medical student, examines Harry and explains in English that the cold has prevented infection, that the wound is not as bad as it looks, that Harry needs rest and food but will probably survive. This simple act of compassion, an enemy soldier using his medical knowledge to help save an American life, moves Ralph in ways he cannot express, and he watches as the German carefully rebandages Harry's wound using supplies from his own medical kit, supplies that German soldiers desperately need, but are giving freely to an enemy. Elizabeth serves the Christmas dinner, and as she says grace in German, Ralph sees tears running down the faces of both German and American soldiers, young men far from home on a night that should be spent with family, united for this brief moment by exhaustion and hunger and the universal longing for peace. The Germans produce a bottle of wine and a loaf of bread, adding to the meal in a gesture of goodwill that transcends nationality, and as they eat, the soldiers begin to talk, using the few English words the Germans know and the limited French Ralph and one of the German soldiers share. The conversation is simple but profound, as they discover they have more in common than differences. The German corporal, 23 years old and clearly educated, admits that he knows Germany has lost the war, that he is fighting now only to protect his family and his country from destruction, not because he believes in Hitler or the Nazi cause. The 2 younger Germans, boys really, teenagers conscripted into service, have never believed in the propaganda, joined the army only because refusal meant death for them and their families. They ask Ralph about America, about what it is like to live in a country where people are free to speak their minds, to worship as they choose, to build lives not dictated by ideology. Ralph, in turn, learns that these German soldiers are Catholics who hate the Nazis for closing churches and persecuting priests, that they have hidden Jews in their villages, that they have sabotaged their own weapons and given false reports to save civilians from bombing. The clear moral lines of the war, the certainty that Americans are right and Germans are wrong, become impossibly blurred as Ralph realizes that courage and decency are not limited to one side, that ordinary people everywhere are victims of leaders who choose war over peace. Through the night, as artillery rumbles in the distance and the Battle of the Bulge continues to kill thousands of soldiers, the small cottage exists in a bubble outside of war, a place where the normal rules do not apply. Harry wakes briefly, finds a German soldier sitting beside his bed, and instinctively reaches for a weapon that is not there. But the German speaks, softly in English, tells Harry he is safe, offers him water, and Harry's fear slowly transforms into cautious trust. Ralph and the German corporal share cigarettes and talk about their families, about the farms and shops and ordinary lives they hope to return to when the war finally ends, about the waste of young lives thrown away by old men who will never see battle themselves. Fritz sits among the soldiers, listening to their stories, understanding for the first time that soldiers are just men who want to go home, that heroism and patriotism are words politicians use while boys die in mud and snow, that his mother's compassion is more powerful than all the armies in the world. The hours pass in a strange combination of tension and camaraderie, with each soldier aware that the truce is temporary, that when morning comes they will return to being enemies, that choosing to preserve this moment of humanity for as long as possible. When dawn breaks on Christmas morning, the spell must end, as German and American soldiers prepare to return to their respective armies and the war that awaits them. The German corporal studies the Americans' map and compass, provides them with directions back to American lines, warning them away from the nearby town of Monschau, which the Germans have recaptured, information that will likely save the Americans' lives, but could be considered treason by the corporal's commanders. The Germans give the Americans the map and compass as gifts, practical tools that might keep them alive, gestures of goodwill from men who hours earlier could have captured or killed them. Ralph wants to thank the Germans, wants to exchange names and addresses, so they might meet again after the war. But the German corporal shakes his head, explaining that it is better if they remain anonymous, that knowledge of this night could be dangerous for everyone involved. The Germans collect their weapons from the woodpile, the Americans retrieve their rifles from inside the cottage, and for a brief moment, all 7 soldiers stand, armed and facing each other, the truce over, the potential for violence real once again. But instead of shooting, they shake hands, German and American fingers clasping, in acknowledgement of their shared humanity, then turn and walk away in opposite directions, returning to a war that suddenly seems more senseless than ever. Ralph and his companions reach American lines 2 days later, on December 27, 1944, carrying Harry, who has survived thanks to the medical attention from the German soldier and the food and rest provided by Elizabeth Finken. They report to their commanding officer, but Ralph makes the decision not to mention the German family or the Christmas Eve truce, knowing that such information could lead to investigation and possible charges of fraternization with the enemy. The 3 men agree to keep the story secret, understanding that their military and their society are not yet ready to hear about Americans and Germans sharing Christmas dinner in the middle of history's bloodiest battle. Ralph returns to combat, fights through the remaining months of the war as American forces push deeper into Germany, sees the devastation that bombing and battle have inflicted on German cities and civilians, and thinks often about Elizabeth and Fritz, wondering if they survived, hoping that the cottage in the forest remained untouched by the war that consumes everything around it. The psychological impact of that Christmas Eve stays with Ralph for the rest of his life, fundamentally changing how he thinks about war, enemies, and the nature of courage. In later years, he tells the story to his family, describes the incredible bravery of a German mother who risked her life and her son's life to help enemy soldiers, talks about the humanity he saw in German soldiers who should have been monsters, questions whether any cause is worth the destruction of people's capacity for compassion. His daughter will later say that her father never forgot Elizabeth Finken, that he spoke of her as a hero whose courage exceeded that of any soldier, that the memory of that night sustained him through decades of nightmares and memories of combat. Ralph keeps the compass given to him by the German corporal, carries it as a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, individuals can choose mercy over hate, can create moments of peace in the midst of war, can recognize the humanity in their enemies when their leaders demand they see only targets. The story remains untold publicly for nearly 3 decades, until Fritz Finken, now living in Hawaii and working as a baker like his father before him, publishes an account in Reader's Digest in January 1973 titled Truce in the Forest. The article describes that Christmas Eve from Fritz's perspective, tells of his mother's incredible courage and the temporary peace she forced upon soldiers who had every reason to kill each other, asks whether any of the soldiers who were there might still be alive, and willing to share their memories. The story moves readers around the world, and President Ronald Reagan references it in a 1985 speech in West Germany as an example of the human spirit's ability to transcend the madness of war. But Fritz's greatest wish is to find the soldiers themselves, to confirm his memories, and to thank the Americans for the trust they showed his mother. A trust that required more courage than any battlefield action, because it meant deliberately making themselves vulnerable to those the war had taught them to hate. For 22 more years, the soldiers remain unknown, until March 24, 1995, when Fritz appears on the television program Unsolved Mysteries, recounting the story once again and appealing to viewers for help locating any of the 7 men who shared his family's Christmas dinner. A chaplain at a nursing home in Frederick, Maryland, watches the program and recognizes the story as one told repeatedly by a resident, a 76-year-old World War II veteran named Ralph Henry Blank, who served with the 121st Infantry Regiment, 8th Division. The chaplain contacts the show's producers. Fritz immediately phones Ralph, and in January 1996, after more than half a century, the American soldier and the German boy who saved his life meet again in Frederick. Ralph, now elderly and in poor health, still has the map and compass given to him by the German corporal that Christmas morning, still remembers every detail of that night with crystal clarity, still credits Elizabeth Finken with saving not just his physical life, but his soul, showing him that humanity persists, even in war's darkest moments. The reunion is captured on film, with Ralph telling Fritz, "Your mother saved my life," and Fritz responding that meeting Ralph is the high point of his own life, confirmation that his mother's courage had meaning beyond that single night. The meeting between Fritz and Ralph reveals the deeper truth about courage in wartime, that the most profound bravery often comes not from those who fight, but from those who choose compassion when violence would be easier and safer. Ralph's decision to knock on that cottage door, to place his life and his friends' lives in the hands of German civilians, required a leap of faith that exceeded any battlefield courage, because it meant trusting in human goodness when everything in his experience suggested such trust would be fatal. Elizabeth's decision to shelter American soldiers, to create a truce between men trained to kill each other, to risk her life and her son's life for strangers who were officially her enemies, represents the kind of moral courage that makes civilization possible, even when civilization appears to be collapsing. The German soldiers who agreed to the truce, who helped save Harry's life, who gave the Americans the tools and information they needed to survive, showed that individual conscience can override orders and propaganda, that humanity persists even in those who serve inhumane causes. Fritz Winken manages to contact one more of the American soldiers before his death in December 2002, almost 58 years to the day after the Christmas truce. But the German soldiers are never found, likely killed in the final desperate months of the war as Germany collapsed and American forces pushed toward Berlin. Ralph Blank passes away a few years after his reunion with Fritz, taking with him memories of the war's horrors, but also the memory of one night when peace was possible, when enemies became friends, when a German mother's courage created a miracle in a forest where thousands were dying. Elizabeth Finken, who died in 1966, never lived to see the recognition her bravery deserved, never knew that her actions on Christmas Eve 1944 would be remembered and celebrated decades later, never understood that her simple act of compassion would inspire people around the world with the proof that individual human beings can choose goodness, even when their nations choose war. The story of Ralph Blank and the Christmas truce of 1944 stands as one of the most powerful examples of courage under fire. Not the courage to kill, but the courage to trust. Not the courage to fight, but the courage to show mercy. Not the courage to follow orders, but the courage to follow conscience. In a war characterized by industrial-scale killing, by hatred cultivated and deployed as a weapon, by propaganda that dehumanized enemies and made atrocities possible, a handful of soldiers and one remarkable woman created a space where such madness could not enter. They proved that the labels of enemy and ally, German and American, are ultimately meaningless in the face of shared humanity. That young men forced to fight one another have more in common with each other than with the leaders who sent them to war. That a mother's instinct to protect and nurture transcends nationalism and ideology. The American military and government were slow to acknowledge stories like Ralph's, preferring narratives of clear heroes and villains, of righteous Americans defeating evil Germans, uncomfortable with tales that showed the enemy as human beings capable of compassion and honor. The official history of World War II, written by victors and focused on grand strategy and major battles, has little room for small stories of individuals choosing mercy, for moments when the clear moral lines of the war became blurred, for evidence that courage might mean refusing to hate rather than learning to kill effectively. But it is precisely these small stories, these individual acts of conscience and compassion, that offer hope for humanity's future, proving that war does not completely destroy people's capacity for goodness, that even in history's darkest hours, individuals can create light. Ralph Blank's story, and the story of Elizabeth Vinken and her son Fricks, reminds us that the most important battles are often fought within individual hearts and minds, where the choice between fear and trust, between hate and compassion, between following orders and following conscience, determines not just who survives, but what kind of people we choose to be. Ralph's decision to knock on that cottage door, knowing it might mean death but choosing to trust in human decency anyway, represents a form of courage that is rarer and more valuable than battlefield heroism, because it requires abandoning the certainties of war for the uncertainties of peace, giving up the clear enemy for the complicated human being, trading the safety of hate for the vulnerability of compassion. Elizabeth's decision to shelter American soldiers, to create a truce that should have been impossible, to risk everything for strangers, because it was Christmas and because it was right, shows that ordinary people possess extraordinary moral courage when they choose to use it, that mothers protecting lives are braver than soldiers taking them. The legacy of that Christmas Eve in 1944 extends far beyond the 7 soldiers and 2 civilians who experienced it, becoming a story that has inspired millions, with proof that humanity persists, even in war's darkest moments, that individuals can create peace, even when their nations are committed to violence, that the choice to show mercy rather than hate is always available, no matter how strong the pressure to conform to warfare's demands. Ralph Blank carried that lesson through his long life, sharing it with everyone who would listen, hoping that future generations might learn from his experience that the real enemy is not the soldier in the different uniform, but the forces that convince ordinary people to kill each other, that the real courage is not in following orders to destroy, but in having the strength to preserve life and dignity, even when doing so violates every rule of war. In a sense, Ralph's greatest act of bravery was not surviving combat or saving his friend, but choosing to remember and celebrate a moment when enemies became human beings, when war's logic was suspended by a woman who insisted that Christmas meant something more important than military necessity, when trust in human goodness proved justified, even though trust should have been fatal. The small cottage in the Hurtgen forest no longer stands, destroyed by subsequent fighting or simply collapsed with age, but the memory of what happened there on Christmas Eve 1944 endures as testimony to the indomitable human spirit, as proof that compassion and courage can coexist, as evidence that individual moral choices matter, even when such choices seem powerless against the vast machinery of war. Ralph Blank, the American soldier who risked everything by trusting a German family. Elizabeth Vinken, the German mother who risked everything by sheltering American soldiers. And the German and American soldiers who accepted a truce that could have cost them their lives. All demonstrated that war does not eliminate human decency, but only tests it, that the capacity for compassion survives even when everything encourages hate, that peace is always possible if individuals are brave enough to create it. Their story is not one of military victory or defeat, not a tale of battles won or strategies successful, but something more important, a reminder that in the midst of humanity's worst impulses, individual human beings can still choose to be humane, can still recognize the sacred worth of every human life, can still create moments of grace that transcend the madness and prove that hope for our species is not misplaced.